Hi, everybody. My name is Howard O, and I'm with the White House Office of Public Engagement. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on our third in our virtual equity series for a month-long programming in celebration and in honor of AA and NHPI Heritage Month. That being said, happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Our theme this year is Building Legacy Together, our community's journey of strength and resilience. Today's session is on educational equity. So for centuries, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have shaped and strengthened the fabric of our nation. Yet many of our communities still continue to face barriers to prosperity and safety, including xenophobic violence, as well as the disproportionate health and economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. So this month, we celebrate our community's journey of resilience, pay tribute to generations of AA and HPIs who have paved the way for good opportunity. We also recommit ourselves to confronting discrimination and hate in all forms, so that together we can create an America that is truly equitable and inclusive for all, which is why we're hosting this virtual equity series and to provide much information needed and resources directly to the community at hand. So with that, excited to introduce Crystal Kai, WHIAANHPI's Executive Director and our close partner at Public Engagement. Crystal?
Thank you, Howard, and aloha, good afternoon, everyone. As the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, or what we call WHIAANHPI, I'm honored to welcome you today and to co-host this event with our colleague Howard O in the Office of Public Engagement in the White House as part of our AA and NHPI Heritage Month virtual equity series, where we have been hosting equity roundtables on different issues throughout the month of May. As we come together today to discuss how we can build a brighter, more equitable future, it is important that we recognize the work of the many individuals that have paved the way for us. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent passing of Secretary Norman Mineta, who was a true trailblazer for our community. And our hearts go out to the Secretary's family and loved ones during this really difficult time. In honoring the legacy of Secretary Mineta, we reflect on the many challenges that we have overcome as a community, as well as the challenges that persist today. And we know that so many of these longstanding inequities have been exacerbated over the past 2.5 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, including access to education and other educational barriers that have really been laid bare over the past 2.5 years. We know that the pandemic has disproportionately affected AA and NHPI communities, not only in terms of our health and economic impacts, but also with the alarming rise in anti-Asian hate and violence we have seen over the course of the pandemic, including bullying in schools, which has become a very pervasive problem. So we want to make sure that through our White House initiative that we are working together to promote access to quality education, address bullying and discrimination, prioritize data disaggregation for our incredibly diverse communities, and work on so many other elements to ensure that we are collectively working to advance educational equity. We know that the model minority myth has been particularly weaponized against our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities to mask disparities among students and their needs that really require additional attention, both from our federal government as well as from leaders all across the country. And during Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are also celebrating the many accomplishments and contributions of our communities and our countless leaders. So we have a really incredible lineup of speakers that you will be hearing from shortly. We also, for the rest of the month, have a number of events that we'll be hosting. Tomorrow, we have a health equity roundtable that we'll be hosting. Next week, we will be doing a data equity event. And on Thursday, May 26th, we'll be having an in-person closing ceremony here in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Department of Interior to close out AA and NHPI Heritage Month. So we'll be sure to share all of these event information with all of you. We would love for you to continue to tune in and join us. And so,
the light's better.
Actually see that. Next, we have our, actually one of our special guests who just joined. It is now my honor to introduce our next speaker, Congressman Mark Takano. Congressman Takano was elected to Congress in 2012 and represents California's 41st Congressional District. He began his career as an educator in California and was later elected to the Riverside Community College District Board of Trustees and became board president, where he worked to improve higher education for young people and job training opportunities for adults. Congressman Takano also serves as chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, a member of the House Education and Labor Committee, and an education task force, and as the education task force chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. It's also one of my former bosses on the Hill. So Congressman Takano, we are so honored to have you here today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here, Crystal. I represent California's 41st Congressional District, and it's an honor to join you all today to advance educational equity for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And I'm grateful to the White House Office of Public Engagement and the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders for hosting this roundtable and for inviting me to be a part of it. This month, we mark Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and this is the time to recognize the accomplishments and contributions of the AAPI communities across the country, and to celebrate the beauty and rich diversity of our many cultures and traditions. And it's also time for us to come together to reaffirm our priorities and advance systems, policies, and practices that will strengthen our community. Now, prior to serving in Congress, I was a public school teacher for 24 years and a community college trustee for more than 2 decades. I'm always going to be an educator at heart, and I truly believe that one of the areas that we can make the greatest impact is in the education policy space. Needless to say, the past 2 years have been incredibly difficult on the APIs as the COVID-19 pandemic heightened the hate and violence directed against members of our community, and unfortunately that included students. Bullying has consistently been an issue among students across the country, but for API students, the pandemic has accelerated this sense of urgency on this issue. And according to Act to Change and Stop API Hate, there were over 3,785 incidences of verbal harassment, shunning, and physical assaults reported in the course of just 1 year. 60% of the incidents involving API youth being bullied by adults, and 41% of the incidents involved youth-on-youth bullying. These statistics are infuriating and heartbreaking at the same time. Thankfully, we did pass in Congress the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and it has since been signed into law by President Biden. And beyond that, we must do more to ensure that students feel safe at school and that their classrooms are conducive to learning and growing. We have much work to do across the board to improve education outcomes for AAPI students, but one of the most relevant barriers to success continues to be the model minority myth. This misperception that inaccurately portrays the diverse AAPI population as homogenous, academically successful, and financially successful. This cannot be more, it couldn't be farther from reality. The reality is that API students face a range of diverse educational challenges, both in K-12 and higher education, and that we must continue to address individual needs and differentiated needs in order for our different communities to succeed. There is a jarring lack of culturally competent education, linguistically appropriate outreach, and all-around lack of access for these students. Now, to fully support our AAPI students from K-12 and beyond, we need to support undocumented students' access to higher education, build and preserve the capacity of schools to serve Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students by expanding the WHIAANHPI program, support early English learner students, improve teacher preparation and diversity, and that's just a start. This work will require all of us and all of our allies to come together and fight for an education system that will give present and future generations the education they need and deserve. I will always keep fighting, and I hope you will join me in the fight for more equity and better outcomes for our community. Events like this one are so important, and once again, thank you for having me here today, Crystal, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow.
Chairman Takano, thank you so much for your remarks and for your leadership in this and many other things. So aloha y'all, and happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'm Erica Moritsugu, Deputy Assistant to the President and Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Senior Liaison at the White House. Thank you to everyone joining this Zoom to discuss the challenges and progress made regarding educational equity for AN and HPI communities. As you know, the past 2 years of the pandemic has been tough on kids and students and their families and their teachers with inconsistent school schedules, remote learning, and feeling isolated from friends and the support network of teachers and school staff. When students began returning to school, many AN and HPI students and families were the victims of COVID-19 related harassment in schools. In fact, last May, the Department of Education wrote a letter to educators to address this increase in harassment and violence directed at AN and HPI students and families, and reminded schools about their role in protecting these kids and members of our communities as we return to in-person learning. Even before the pandemic, AN and HPI communities have long faced systemic educational inequities, with the model minority myth that the chairman and Crystal have spoken about coming top to mind. But it's also the perpetual foreigner myth that has led to the targeting and victimization on a physical security level, which has also obviously got a big impact on social and emotional safety for our children in schools. So the pandemic really spotlighted the longstanding inequities impacting communities of color, including educational inequity. This is why I'm excited for this roundtable today, and I'm pleased to introduce our special guest for this fireside chat. Secretary and Dr. Cardona was sworn in as our 12th Secretary of Education on March 2nd, 2021. He was previously the Commissioner of Education in Connecticut, which was a position he held since August 2019, when just months later, the pandemic hit the United States, and he was in a critical leadership position to provide guidance to school districts in Connecticut during this unprecedented and uncertain time. Secretary Cardona is a former public school educator himself, beginning his career as an elementary school teacher and then serving as a school principal, for which he was recognized with the state of Connecticut for his excellence. Of course, I'm only sharing a few highlights of his distinguished career. So, Secretary Cardona, thank you for making the time to join us today to discuss what I view as an important topic, and you clearly do too, since you prioritize it in your day. I'm going to hand the Zoom floor over to you before we begin our fireside chat. So, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erica. So glad to be with you and everyone on the call, and happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. At the Department of Education, we're proud to support the White House initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. The diversity of this community really inspires me. Your families represent over 50 different ethnic groups and speak more than 100 languages. You are the multicultural fabric of America. I'm proud that respect for diversity drives so many of this administration's efforts to build a more just, equitable nation. The American Rescue Plan invested over $120 billion in our public schools to help drive those efforts by reopening our schools and supporting educators in the vital work of recovery in the pandemic. And I'm proud to say that nearly 100% of our schools are now open for in-person learning today, compared to under 50% when President Biden took office. But we can't stop there. Learning gaps are wider among underserved students, including students who may not speak English at home. Our department is working with state and local leaders to ensure the American Rescue Plan funds help every student recover academically, but also socially and emotionally. It's really time now for us to reimagine what schools can be and not return to a system that wasn't working for all students, including some of our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students. This pandemic weighed heavily on all of us, but the burden was even heavier for these students who faced bullying, harassment, and COVID-related violence. Our children will struggle to learn if they don't feel safe. Our Office for Civil Rights has advised schools on how to address bullying. Hate has no place in education at any level. On the higher education side, our department has also made historic investments in minority-serving institutions, including $5 billion for Anapizis. Colleges have used these funds to meet students' basic needs, help keep them enrolled, and expand the much-needed mental health supports on campus. It's time we focus less on which institutions are the most exclusive and more on colleges that are more inclusive and more accessible to all students. Let's continue investing in affordability, from increasing Pell Grant awards, to supporting programs that help high schoolers graduate with college credits, those dual enrollment programs. I've always believed that education is America's great equalizer. And I know so many Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander families feel the same. Thank you again for having me, and let's get the conversation started.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for your wisdom and your words and your leadership. There you are. I can see you now. Education is the great equalizer. Thank you so much for speaking that truth and also making it our reality and our future. Let me start with a question about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it abruptly disrupted education in this country. Remote learning posed a host of challenges, particularly for higher needs students or those lacking access to a home environment that's conducive for learning. And with the majority of students having returned to the classroom, would you speak to some of the challenges and trends unfolding across the nation?
Sure. Let me first acknowledge that it was tough for everyone, but it was tougher for some more than others. And I would include our AAPI students there who had to deal with the addition of bullying and violence, COVID-related violence and negative comments and just a culture of negativity. So, not only dealing with loss or with the inability to access teachers the way they did in person, they had to deal with a culture of, am I going to feel accepted here? Am I going to feel welcome back in school? I remember talking to students who said, I'm not going back when the doors open because I'm dealing with a lot of bullying and I'd rather not go back. And I've heard from parents that said, you know what, I'm not going to send my children into an environment if they're going to get bullied or if they're going to get looked at or comments are going to be made to them. So we were not only worrying about the physical safety with COVID-19, but also the emotional safety of AAPI students. And I want to acknowledge that. I think at the Department of Education, we recognize that and we worked really hard to send out information. We sent out a letter guidance with Department of Justice to educators. OCR did as well. We acknowledge this. So that's something that I want to just first and foremost acknowledge, that this was something that we were very aware of. And we did everything, and we're going to continue to fight to make sure that that has no place in our schools. But overall, we also saw lack of community. Our schools are communities. They're like second families for our students, for our educators, and for our parents. So not having that really created a sense of loss for students. That emotional connection that schools provide, peer relationships with teachers, that was lacking because of the online format. I also think we saw disparities in terms of digital access, right? Broadband isn't the same throughout the country. So not only did we have a digital divide, we also had a relational divide. And then we know students missed out on quality core instruction. So their access to high quality, rigorous academic content was lacking. So all that put together led to a reopening that was needed, number one, but one that we had to approach differently. We can't approach it with the same tools that we did before. We are increasing access to mental health supports, and we are increasing access to digital tools so that students have access no matter where they are. Our kids are not well, but they're getting better. And I have to commend our educators and families for working together to make that possible.
Thank you. I would like to commend this president and his administration and your leadership. That the Department of Education has made creating safe and supportive learning environments for all students a top priority. And education equity is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. Well, we know that there's a lot of work to be done to uplift AANHPI students. It's been a challenge to quantify their needs because data collection practices have long aggregated or rolled up the population to a group of AAPI, effectively masking disparities amongst underserved students. I was so pleased to read in the Department of Education's agency equity plan that data disaggregation is a priority. Can you share a bit about what's being done to ensure that policymakers, community leaders, and educators alike all have access to this valuable information? Because as you know, we can't make good policy without good data.
Exactly. And I heard the myth, right? The model myth several times before I came on, and I've been talking to folks who really that concerns them, and I can tell you, the NFPZ community is not a monolith, right? And as a Latino who is often, my family's from Puerto Rico, but oftentimes Latinos are painted with a broad brush. I know that experience. And I want to make sure that we're looking at disaggregating data in a way that really shows the truth, that there are many communities that under this myth that are struggling more than most others. And they're never getting the attention because there's this myth that's pervasive. So at the Department of Education, we don't look at equity as a thing, as a department, or as something that you check the box. It really is a lens through which we look at everything we do. So whether you're applying for a grant or we're identifying programs that we want to support, equity has to be baked into the entire program. And that means that we're looking at disaggregation more acutely and as a natural course of action in our work. And we're working with districts to make sure that they're looking deeper than the basic boxes, if you will, and looking for subgroups that need more support in a culturally responsive way and in a language they understand. So we're also working with WHIAANHPI to make sure that we can work together on providing guidance to states and districts on how to take that to the next level. Because I agree, I don't think we're doing it sufficiently, and there's a lot of work to be done there.
No, these are words to live by and to guide our work. Equity has to be baked in, right? Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, or ANAPISIs, which you referenced in your opening, they do play a vital role in supporting ANHPI scholars. What are some of the ways that the Department of Education is planning to increase support for existing ANAPISIs or expand the number of ANAPISIs?
Well, the budget, the 23 budget proposes $15 million for ANAPISIs. We know the important work they do. And we have to make sure that as much as resources matter, so does their voice. Making sure that we're listening and we're engaging with them regularly to listen to their perspective and to listen to their unique needs and challenges as we try to reimagine what schools are like and try to reach those students who we're struggling to reach. So as long as I'm secretary, we're going to continue to make sure that they have a voice at the Department of Education, that there's ongoing communication, and that we're listening to what they're saying and taking into account what they're saying in order to make sure that our policy reflects what their needs are. We're going to continue to fight for more resources as well, because we know in many cases, it's not the same throughout the country. There are different needs in different parts of the country. So listening, making sure their voices are heard, and fighting for resources based on what their needs are is what you're going to get from us at the department.
I'm glad I'm glad that the answer is good because I asked to. And I'm so proud of what is reflected as our policy and our priorities, because our budget is a moral document too.
Right.
One of the other things that I admire so much about your leadership, if you don't mind me saying, that I've observed, is how intentionally inclusive you are. Pulling in diverse members of community for listening sessions, traveling to them. Yeah. So a lot of folks have the chance to see you and talk to you and hear from you. But for today, as a final question, for those who haven't had the chance to interact with you directly, I think they would love to know from you what, as a former educator and as a parent, what advice do you have for parents or community leaders that are trying to better support their learners at this time?
First of all, it's my responsibility to be out there, to be listening, to kind of have my ear to the ground, to see what parents and students and educators need, so that we could position the resources and the leverage and the bully pulpit around what the needs are, right? And aim high. So that's my responsibility and my team's responsibility to be a service agency, to make sure that we're responsive to what's happening in our country at this time in our country's history. So my message to families is, we work for you. We serve you, we serve your children, and it's an honor to serve as secretary at a time like this, where our kids need us more now than ever. Our families need us now more than ever. So for me, as I said in my remarks, the goal is not to go back to what it was in March 2020. That's insufficient for so many families, including AAPI families. Like, we have to do better. We have to do better. And part of that is listening. So to the families, you are your child's most influential teacher. We're a supporting cast, educators from the teacher all the way to the secretary. We are a supporting cast. And it's important that we listen and that your voice is welcome into the conversation. You know your children better than anyone. So continue to work with the schools, to partner, to lift up the concerns that you have and celebrate the successes. That's how we're going to move forward together.
On fire. Thank you, Secretary. Mr. Secretary, it's been an honor to share this space with you for this candid conversation. You've been very generous with your time, and we're very, very grateful.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Crystal Kai, I'm going to pass the hot Zoom mic over to you and yield the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you so much, Secretary Cardona. We're truly grateful to have you with us today and so inspired by your leadership. Next, I'll be introducing our community panel. So as all of us know, so much of this work on the ground would not happen without the work of so many advocates, community leaders who are doing tireless work to promote and advance educational equity for our communities. So I'm going to start off with our community panelists, if we can make sure everybody turns on their cameras. First, we have Noel Harmon, the President and Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholars. We'll also be hearing from Mark Mitsui, the President of Portland Community College, as well as the former President of the National Asian Pacific Islander Council of the American Association for Community Colleges. We also have Elena Farden, who is the Executive Director of the Native Hawaiian Education Council, as well as Joseph Canarias, who serves on the Board of Directors of Act 2 Change. So we are so honored to have all of you here with us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to join us. I know that each of you represents a different sector within the educational field, meaning that you are directly interacting and hearing from a variety of members of our diverse AA and NHPI communities. Can you speak to some of the primary challenges that you have witnessed or heard about over the course of the pandemic? And this is a question for all of our panelists. So let's go ahead and start off with Noel.
Thank you so much, Crystal and Erica and Secretary Cardona. Thank you so much for inviting API scholars and myself. It has been a crazy 2.5 years. I can't even believe the time has gone by so quickly. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, we really saw a lot of our students that we serve were experiencing issues with just basic needs. It was really horrifying to find that the issues were really around housing and finding a place to live during the pandemic, maybe finding the funds to get home, and food insecurity was something that we heard a lot about as we opened up our emergency aid. I think in an hour, we had used almost all of our aid, and a lot of it was around food and housing insecurities. As the pandemic has gone on, as the Secretary mentioned, I think our students also experienced a lot of, as it pertained to school, inequities in their ability to get onto the internet, broadband access, things that we often take for granted, even those little hotspot things were really valuable during that time. And finally, just a note to say that our students, even prior to the pandemic, but certainly as the pandemic has gone on, mental health and wellness has been something that has been a huge challenge for most of our students during this time.
So, well, President Mitsui, could you speak to some of the challenges that you've heard from a community college perspective or from just higher education in terms of access to higher education?
Thank you, Crystal and Erica and Secretary Cardona for this opportunity. I echo Noel's observations as well. Basic needs and security amongst our students was at very high levels before the pandemic. We participated in a real college survey. About 60% of respondents indicated that they experienced either food or housing insecurity before the pandemic. We had the same survey administered during the pandemic, and the rates were higher. And our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students were severely impacted with housing and food insecurity, as well as job insecurity during the pandemic. So the federal emergency grants that came out from the Biden administration were extremely helpful in not only helping students to access food, housing, help with tuition and books and childcare, also with being able to access class through the ability to purchase laptops and hotspots. And so that was a big assist for our students. And it also spurred some state work to help address basic needs and security amongst our students, partnerships with our State Department of Health and Human Services, work on affordable housing and other kinds of initiatives that Portland Community College and other Oregon community colleges engaged in. And I also agree with Noel and want to emphasize the mental health challenges and issues that our students faced. Some of it secondary to the anti-Asian hate incidents, some of it related to COVID, much of it related to the economic pressures that so many of our first-gen low-income students experienced during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, President Mitsui. Elena, we know that unfortunately, oftentimes Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander communities are face even more significant challenges than we, than are captured sometimes in our federal data. And so can you speak to, again, some of the challenges that you've seen throughout the pandemic impacting Native Hawaiian students that you serve?
Sure, thanks, Crystal, and thanks, Secretary Cardona and everyone for this opportunity. Sure, in the past 2 years have been a challenge, and usually with a challenge, we can see growth, whether that's going to be positive or negative. And for our Native Hawaiian communities, we're seeing a sense of reverse growth. So coming into the pandemic, having a sense of hope, of visibility of these long-standing disparities, and then emerging from the pandemic with a heavier sense of invisibility of action and lack of social change. And we know this from our annual community consultations that happen each year. So from January through April, we just completed ours. We did 22 consultations. And from that, some of the primary challenges that we're hearing from community that we're learning with them is, again, our crisis of teacher shortage in Hawaii. And that's particularly around our Hawaiian immersion teachers. In particular, was a parent that shared an unverified story about her child that was staying in the school cafeteria with their class all day for study hall because there was a lack of teachers and substitutes for that day. The second is going to be institutional barriers to innovation and student success. And this is specific to Aina-based, land-based learning, some of the sentiments that have been shared by Mark and Noel. And it's through our community consultation sessions, we're learning from and with our community was food insecurity was a major stressor in the pandemic, and consequently underlying the incredible importance of Aina-based or land-based, environmental-based learning programs, the ability to grow our own food, the value of Aina practices in our educational opportunities and quality of life. And we know nationally 20.5% of NHPIs are food insecure, and that directly and indirectly contributes to related factors such as increased healthcare costs, limited access to resources and income, and of course, a correlation to poor physical health. And then probably the third sort of challenges that we're seeing overall from our families and our students and teachers was a larger disconnect that they felt with the educational system at large, that it was constructed sort of piecemeal versus constructed in a way that addresses total well-being, again, addressing the total health, mental health, physical health, emotional health of our students. So those are some of the challenges that we saw. And I just want to round it out with something more positive that Secretary Cardona had touched upon. What was a positive thing that was found in our communities during the pandemic is that positioning relationships as an anchor of stability and structure was essential. They saw schools help organize community. So it was that sense of belonging, learning environment, connection with peers and teachers. So when we think about DEI for Native Hawaiians, we think of DEIB, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and B for belonging. So.
Lena, Joseph, what about you? What are some of the challenges that you've heard given your role as a board member of Act to Change and all of the work that you do with working with our youth?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Crystal. So at the beginning of our hour here, Representative Takano mentioned that there was over close to 4,000 incidents of bullying that students experienced throughout. And that data point came from a survey that we helped kind of distribute nationally. And we know that's just a small fraction of the true realities. That 4,000 is such a small number in terms of the realities of the amount of bullying and harassment that youth across the country, API youth across the country experience, specifically in the early days of the pandemic, as the data also showed that out of all of our respondents, they saw a 900% increase on online hate and harassment, and that over 80% of the folks in that survey witnessed or experienced it themselves. And I think it's really important for us to really recognize that due to the overall increased isolation, lack of people for API youth to disclose to. And that survey also shared that when students do report or disclose, a third of adults don't do anything about it. They don't take any action. And so I think it's really the past couple of years has really highlighted how much work we still need to do, and just this increased normalization of anti-API bullying and hate and its overall impacts on youth we have so much work left to do. And I think not only is it our jobs as educators and our communities to really start to believe in our students when they disclose, but we really have to start doing something about it. Because when we're layering on cultural barriers and when we're layering on everything we've been talking about around the model minority myth, it already makes it really hard for folks to come forward, but then it's letting them down when they do come forward and nothing happens. And so I think it's really all on us to make sure that we help create campus cultures, school cultures that take it seriously. And so when folks do disclose, something does happen.
Sharing that, Joseph. Mark, about half of our AA and NHPI students actually attend community college, which many people are always surprised by that statistic. And we know that community colleges are actually a primary path of educational attainment for our communities. Many of these schools are on PCs that the Secretary and Erica mentioned earlier, or Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. So recognizing the important role that these institutions play, could you share some of the ways in which community colleges could be better supported in your opinion?
Absolutely. You raise a really important point. Not only are half of all ANHPI students in higher ed in the community colleges, over half of those students are in the Untitled. And so a relatively small number of institutions are doing a great job serving a large proportion of a rapidly growing student population in the US higher education system. So the Untitled serve Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students in a variety of ways, including culturally relevant teaching, pedagogy, culturally relevant and applicable or appropriate curriculum. For many of our students, is the first time that their lives are reflected in the text of the course. And that can be incredibly, incredibly powerful. In addition, culturally specific services like counseling and advising are also infused through Untitled funding, and a variety of other more formal community connections are made between the community colleges and the ANHPI communities that they serve. So expanding the Untitled funding and expanding the Untitled program, I think, is a key strategy for supporting the institutions that serve Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students. And so in looking at that funding level and what's really needed, first of all, I want to thank the Secretary and Department of Education and the Biden administration for increasing the funding to the Untitled. And in addition to that, I want to also note the size of the need writ large. So while currently there are about 20 institutions that are funded, there are also about 166 institutions that are eligible for Untitled grants. And if that funding can be increased to serve and to meet the growing community of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander scholars, the dollar amount that eventually would be a great goal to reach is about 100 million. And so the need is there. The gains that have been made have been record gains. I mean, we've not seen this kind of increase prior to this administration. And I think putting a marker down for the future also helps to create an objective to shoot for in the future. In addition, another way that these institutions can be served is by re-examining the multiple designation issue. And so right now, it's not possible to hold two Part A grants. So in other words, if you're an Untitled Part A for Title III, and you're an HSI Part A Title V, those two are considered mutually exclusive. And so if there's either a regulatory or a statutory fix that would allow institutions, particularly in states like California, to be both HSIs and Untitleds, that would be tremendously helpful for those institutions to be able to serve both communities. I want to say too that both the increase in funding for Untitleds as well as allowing multiple designations it shouldn't be an either or and result in a reduction of funding for other categories. And I know the Secretary supports increasing funding for all MSIs, which is also badly needed. So we appreciate the Biden administration's efforts to advocate for increased MSI funding and believe that that is the way to go, that we need additional funding for all categories of minority serving institutions. Also, another area that would be helpful is looking at IPEDS and how IPEDS data is utilized to determine eligibility, including using FTE as opposed to headcount. And so if there's a possibility of looking at, for example, part-time headcount as a way of calculating eligibility, that would be helpful because our community colleges serve students with advising and counseling, whether they're part-time or full-time. And we still also need to and will, of course, process financial aid applications. So those service costs are there. We want to be able to serve. Majority of community college students are part-time. And so how the funding and eligibility could be reflected. And finally, we appreciate the administration's efforts to make Pell, to make undocumented students eligible for Pell. And there is a significant undocumented community within the NHPI student community, particularly in the community colleges. Lastly, because of the large number of immigrant students, students with immigrant experiences in the community colleges, I want to give a shout out for the House passage of the WHIAANHPI bill. Representative Takano is a member of the Ed Labor Committee, chaired by Oregon's Suzanne Bonamici. That passed out of the House, which is great. Title II of WHIAANHPI pays for English as a second language instruction and adult basic ed instruction. The model minority myth obscures the fact that a lot of our students, a lot of our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students didn't finish high school or are at lower levels of English proficiency, particularly our adult Asian American students. And so integrated education and training is a strategy that works. And this is where you combine ESOL and content for adult students. And we have 43 million adults in the United States at level 1 literacy, according to PIAC. Huge demand. We have enough public funding to help 1 out of the 43 million. And Asian American communities in particular are highly represented within that community. What IET does is it combines ESL with phlebotomy or with nursing. Students pick up English faster, they pick up healthcare faster, more likely to graduate, more likely to get jobs, and employers get bilingual employees. So those
Thank
are
you
a
so
few
much,
ways.
Mark. I really appreciate. Yeah, that's the, there's a lot of great work that needs to be done, and also that is already being done by the current administration. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I know we are a little bit short on time. We have about 10 minutes left, but I do want to get to our other panelists. And so, we talked a lot about the model minority myth, and we know again how harmful it is when our data is aggregated together and oftentimes mask significant disparities that exist. We see that in particular with our Southeast Asian American communities, as well as with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in particular. And so, Elena, really quickly, I wanted to see if we can have you talk a little bit more about some of the unique issues that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities face that may not always be brought to the forefront. You kind of alluded to this a little bit when you talked about language immersion programs. So, oftentimes when you think of the Asian American community, they talk about language access. But for our Indigenous communities, the issues are a little bit different. So if you could just share a little bit about the work that you're doing. And just so we have time for our other panelists, if we can just make sure, just fairly concise answer, I apologize, but just really appreciate all of you being here with us today. So Elena, we'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Language and culture live at the heart of all we do, whether we're teaching it, we're speaking it, we're advocating for it. And we know that we're living in this point of history where within 2 generations, most languages in the world will die out. So this relates to us for Native Hawaiian communities when we think about school choice, the resources and funding and support available for parents and schools to choose the kind of education they want for their children in the language and culture of their choice. So the work that we're doing as a council is really as an advocate and intermediary in this work. And I say this to give honor and celebration to all of those grantee programs and organizations that have really paved the way for Hawaiian language preservation and cultural education. So as an advocate and intermediary in this space, the council's role has been twofold, and that's to advocate for equitable funding for these anchor programs for our students and teachers and families in the community. And then the second is to reclaim the full narratives of critical impact of these programs that are not only hitting all of their targets, measures, and outcomes, but we're seeing that they're also addressing education in very deep and innovative ways for success. So we've done that through federal and state advocacy. We're doing that through research and evaluation. And I think that also calls to what Erica had mentioned earlier, that without good data, we can't have good policy. So we're doubling down on our research and evaluation on these programs. We know what's happening and why it's happening, but now we want to know when. When in the cycle of your grant or your program does this happen, so that we can better understand the types of strategies that we can deploy for grantee program and community success. And then lastly, just to wrap up, Secretary Cardona had just mentioned this in his fireside about the department as a supporting cast when it comes to parents as the main teachers. The council is really positioned that way for our grantee programs and community, that we support their efforts in that stronger sense of advocacy. For the council, we make our moves in silence and we allow the fruits of advocacy to stand in that success. Thanks.
So, Noelle, I know with your organization, API Scholars, you're really focused on providing pathways to higher education for our communities. And, again, just throughout the course of this conversation, it's become so clear that there is a lot of need. I'm just hearing about a lot of the challenges that you all mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, some of the significant needs that students are facing, including access to really basic resources and funding. And again, this goes against the model minority myth that is often associated with our communities. But could you speak a little bit more to what strategies that you believe are effective in increasing AA and NHPI inclusion and representation in education, and especially with regard to access to higher education, where we still see very significant disparities for subpopulations of our communities? Noelle, you are on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I should know that by now. I just want to echo everything that Mark said, because he did such a great job of really talking a lot about what our students who are attending on PZs and community colleges are going through. The root issue for us, and something that the Secretary mentioned already, is the need to disaggregate our data. We have to understand who our students are with that critical eye to what data tells us. It's important to building inclusive approaches to ensuring that our students have access and success and are successful to and through college. And I'll just use the FAFSA as a quick example. It currently collects information the way it does. It really obscures disparities, unique challenges, and just the income inequalities that are so much across our diverse AA and HPI communities, impacting, of course, then their ability to afford college. As the FAFSA simplification plan is implemented in the coming months, data disaggregation, it truly becomes a key civil rights issue for our communities.
Well, and last but not least, Joseph, I know you talked about this a little earlier, but just again, our students have faced an uptick in bullying throughout the pandemic. And we know this existed prior to the pandemic, but has really been exacerbated over the past 2.5 years. And this has also led to a lot of mental health challenges that we are hearing from students as a result of being bullied in school or not feeling safe, quite honestly, going back to school or in their school environment. So in your opinion, how can we better support our students and create a safe and inclusive learning environment for all of them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think one of the things we want to highlight that today is National Day Against AAPI Bullying and Hate. And here at Act of Change, we have been able to work with youth over the past 2.5 years who have really shared with us that it's okay to not be okay. And that it's really important for our youth to feel like they can come and ask for help and need that support. And I think overall, as a collective and in our communities, it's really important for us, especially as AAPI folks, to destigmatize what it means to seek mental health supports, and for us to unlearn those harmful myths and narratives around what that really truly means. And I think if we're really trying to work towards, healing campus cultures that really help ensure that everyone feels safe, we need to really start debunking and unlearning those myths around what that means, that it's okay to not be okay, that we are here to support you, and that everything you're going through, that you are not alone, that people are here to believe you, people are here to support you. And a lot of our youth really don't feel like that's a possibility. And so it's something that we're really trying to work towards. And that's what really today is really all about, that it's been a hard 2.5 years. How can we really make sure that we can provide those supports to our youth? And so that's one thing we can really work towards as here at Act of Change, is we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you for that, Joseph. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to give all of our panelists, if you want to just leave us with any parting words, that we've been, again, so grateful for this conversation. I feel like we could have easily gone another hour, and there's just so much to talk about, but we're really grateful for the insight you were able to share today. So any closing remarks for each of our panelists before we close out our session? I can start with you, Mark.
Again, thank you for the opportunity to share, but also to hear all the great work that's happening across the country, and for organizing this celebration in Heritage Month. It's so important for us to be able to hold up our culture's history and share that. Thank you.
Noelle?
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to just get to hear the work that's going on across the country. I'm writing everybody's name down. Can't wait to link in with all of you and figure out ways that we can work together. I think we didn't get to talk about the importance of collaboration, but I think that is key in the work that we're doing, and any opportunities we have to work together, we are stronger for it. So thank you.
Well, Elena?
Again, thank you all for this opportunity. And I challenge the department and all of our fellow advocates in education to really hone in on the expertise of our community as a whole. So not only our listening sessions, but make community a co-researcher, a co-data researcher, a co-investigator, and all of these things that we are trying to solve together. Mahalo.
Much. And Joseph?
Yeah, thank you again so much. I guess my last parting words is that we really want to make sure that all of our work is led by the youth that we serve. We want to make sure that they're the ones steering the conversations. They're the ones who really are providing the input and expertise, as they're the ones who are living the experiences that we are trying to really end all these challenges and barriers that are placed in front of them. So I think that's one thing we really want to make sure, have youth take the lead.
Thank you again to all of our esteemed panelists, and of course to Erica Moritsugu, Howard O, and all of our team who had worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. thanks to everybody who tuned in today. We hope that some of you will be able to join us tomorrow for our Health Equity Roundtable, as well as for our equity events next week. Mahalo and have a great rest of your day.